All right, so I'm here with my friend Greta Aurora, and we are going to talk about some non-celebrity news. Well, I'm not sure. I mean, does Zelensky count? I guess that's part of what we're going to be talking about. Is Zelensky a celebrity or not? Yeah, so we were going to talk. I wanted to talk about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and specifically, we're not here to adjudicate all facets of that, and neither of us are, international policy experts, but we're smart people, and you especially, I think, are better versed in some European history and politics than I am. So I wanted to go over some of this stuff with you, and particularly, I don't know much about this situation, but I am, like you, I'm suspicious of media narratives, and it seems like the media are so heavily, completely, totally on the side of Ukraine and Zelensky to this, to the point of like no other narratives are even worthy of consideration according to the mainstream media. And so I wanted to look at this more deeply and see if there are, see if there's anything to be concerned about with the media narratives that we're getting about Ukraine and Zelensky and so forth. And then, of course, this is all very relevant because in the news today is the fact that a stray missile apparently went over the Ukrainian line and accidentally got into Poland. A little issue there. So that's been in the news a lot. And I saw on Twitter, World War III was trending, and people worried that we might be about to get into World War III and all of that. So tell me kind of, you are Hungarian, right?
Yes.
Okay. So you are Hungarian, and you obviously have much closer proximity to Ukraine and Russia than I do, and probably a lot more knowledge. Kind of what are you feeling these days about the situation and the way that it's being depicted in the media? Do you have any concerns about it?
So I just want to point out briefly that I grew up in Hungary, but I've been living in England for almost 12 years now. I spent a year in the US as well, halfway through. So I'm very familiar with Western media, Western mainstream media as well, but I try to just keep a broad mind about these things. So what happened last night, I was quite worried about it. And this is a good example, actually, of how, as much as I aim to always question whatever I hear in the mainstream media, yesterday, once again, I just took it for granted. Zelensky went on TV asking for NATO Article 5 to be triggered, which NATO Article 5 basically means that all NATO countries, once one country is attacked, all NATO countries would then respond and attack the aggressor. So in this case, the narrative was that it was a Russian missile, probably not on purpose, but maybe a stray Russian missile that lost its target, instead hit Poland, killing 2 people. And Zelensky immediately just fed us that narrative. And I guess all the Western media was just ready to go with that narrative straight away. I mean, to give them some credit, they did encourage people to just wait for the investigation to be completed. But this morning, we now have the news that the missiles weren't fired from Russia. They were fired from Ukraine.
What?
The NATO Secretary General has announced this. The Polish president has confirmed it. They're saying it's 100%. Even Biden, late last night, early this morning, Biden was also saying, according to US intelligence, this didn't come from Russia. So what they're saying now, and it's still unfolding, but the latest at the moment is that it's an old Soviet-made type of missile, but it's mostly used for defense purposes. So the most likely scenario is that it was fired by the Ukrainians to try to shoot down a Russian missile. So it's a Russian missile in the sense that it was made in the Soviet Union. So Russian made, but it was fired from Ukrainian territory, probably not targeting Poland,
So what does that mean then if it's the Ukrainians who accidentally hit Poland? Does that mean that they need the NATO articles trigger against them?
I was thinking about it. In theory, NATO should now attack Ukraine, but that's not how it works. I mean, if the article is ever triggered, then there's like discussions and negotiations and stuff. And having mentioned negotiations, diplomacy is something that has been missing from this whole situation, looking back at the last 7 months, just even mentioning the word diplomacy on social media means that you must be a puppet of the Kremlin and you're just parroting Putin's propaganda. You're not supposed to ask for peace talks or negotiations or diplomacy of any kind. And I find this terrifying. I find this really, really scary, actually.
That's an excellent point. I mean, it seems like everyone, in Western media and the public, of course, I know the public's not very well informed generally, but it seems like almost everyone is not only on the side of Ukraine, which I understand that, they're in the defensive position, or at least that's the narrative, right? But not only on the side of Ukraine, but like you said, it seemed to be resistant to the idea that there could be any peace talks or any diplomacy, that would be, caving into Putin and being a stooge for Putin and all of that. And I see like Tulsi Gabbard, who I don't agree with her on everything, and some of her economic ideas don't gel with me, but she's a real hero of mine. And she has been adamant, the congresswoman from Hawaii, she's been adamant about the fact that this situation is not as one-sided as it seems, and that there is room for diplomacy, and that we shouldn't be rushing into a militaristic stance, particularly the United States, needs to stay out of this. So did you want to talk a little bit about where you think the media is getting this narrative wrong? You say that there should be more room for diplomacy. What about Zelensky? Like, we over here in the US, we know nothing about this guy, except I hear he used to be a comedian, and he does those Vogue photo shoots, and he looks like really hot with his pecs and everything, and those army shirts that he wears. But I don't know anything about him. Is there something that we're not educated about regarding Zelensky?
And he was a very successful actor. He played president of Ukraine in a TV series. It was almost like a 3-year presidential campaign. So the premise of the series was that he was playing a high school teacher who just goes on this rant about corruption in the country. He's just talking to a colleague, and one of his students secretly videos his rant. And then they basically launch a campaign for him, and then he's elected, and then he just knows he doesn't even want to be there, but then he kind of, by accident, he makes good decisions and stuff. It's a comedy. And it's just incredible that it launched, I think, in 2015. And then he announced he was running for the presidency 3 years later. So he was running for those 3 years. So it's all it's like the whole thing is kind of like a reality show. And I have so much, just to think about the amount of suffering in Ukraine right now, people without water, electricity, people have no food. It has been a poor country for the last 30 years, but it has never been a prosperous part of the world. But obviously people have a right to be optimistic about the future, to have something to look towards. And right now it is a very, very bleak situation. I really, really empathize with those people, but no one really, I don't think the American government really cares about Ukrainian people. And that's why I'm so concerned about the lack of talks about diplomacy, and how we're not even supposed to mention the word diplomacy. So I just feel like those poor people, they're being used as pawns on a chessboard. And Zelensky is supposed to be representing those people. What are the people's interests? Whose interest is it for the war to continue indefinitely? Whose interest is it for all those weapons and all that money to be fed into the country? Everyday Ukrainians are not benefiting from it. What they would benefit from would be peace, and for the country to move on, and for cities to be rebuilt. And we need to go into the background of this, because people know nothing about this, who only watch CNN and MSNBC. They're just going to say that, yeah, but it all started in February with Putin's invasion, and that's it. So again, in Western media, they treat this conflict as though there was no precedent whatsoever.
There was no build up to it or anything, right?
It happened on the 24th of February. Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia is the aggressor. The war is not going to end unless Russian troops pull out. And let me just make it clear that obviously Russia is the aggressor. Obviously Russia is at fault. I'm not saying that's not the case, but there is more to it. So what people need is some nuance in this conversation, and like in most media narratives in general. And I understand there's only so much you can cover in a late night show or on the news. But basically, about a year ago, almost a year ago now, in December 2021, Putin came forward with a, he basically said that there was a list of kind of demands. He was saying that a war was inevitable unless NATO withdrew its troops to where they were in 1997, and unless he received some guarantee that Ukraine was going to remain neutral. And this was completely ignored by governments, by the media. But this is not when it all began. This is just the immediate, lead up of events to the invasion. But there's been intellectuals around the world, politicians and academics who have been warning about this. Henry Kissinger is one who's been talking about this since the 80s. There are German politicians, both left and right-wing politicians, who have been very concerned about this. So Ukraine joining the NATO was first seriously proposed in 2008 at the Bucharest summit. And it was like a formal kind of proposal to kind of initiate talks. It's a very, very long procedure. But two countries, Germany and France, vetoed it. And it was, and Angela Merkel was German chancellor at the time, and Nicolas Sarkozy was the French president, and they both said that it would be a completely unacceptable provocation and threat. So Merkel, more than anyone else, she had quite a decent, very civil relationship with Putin, and she really understood the broader context around this. She understood what Ukraine meant to Russia. Kissinger also understood this. Helmut Kohl, the longest reigning German chancellor, who was a conservative politician, understood this. Then there's Klaus von Dohnanyi, who was a German socialist politician, left-wing. He published a book about this just before the invasion, just early this year, a book titled National Interests. He basically predicted, he didn't claim this was going to happen within the next few weeks or months, but he said that this was the direction we were moving in. So many people foresaw this. And one philosophical question that you might be interested in, something that's been on my mind a lot.
Let me just stop you right there for a second. And I understand what you're saying. I think just to clarify it, though, bring some things out. What I think you're saying is that historically, Russia obviously has had a lot of anxiety, like a lot of nations, over its security and its borders, and also the sort of the equilibrium or the disequilibrium of power. And so the idea of Ukraine joining NATO, that it would move from a more neutral status to something that would be more aligned against Russia, right? Is that the idea? So I guess what I'm saying is, what was the problem with Ukraine joining NATO from Russia's perspective?
So Russian and Ukrainian history were really inseparable for the better part of 1,000 years. And all Slavic people trace their origins to that part of the world that's now around Kiev. And Russia traces its origins to the Kievan Rus, which is a region that is present-day Kiev.
Present-day Ukraine, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes. I'm using the Ukrainian pronunciation of the capital as opposed to
Kiev.
No,
I know.
It might piss some people off.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
So I'm trying to be respectful of that. So then there's the issue of Crimea. So Sevastopol has been the home to Russia's Black Sea Fleet since the late 18th century. And it's an iconic fleet. It's the most important for Russia. It secures kind of their presence on the Black Sea. It's historically, it's a very, very important fleet of ships. And it has been stationed at Sevastopol in Crimea because Crimea, the peninsula, has belonged to Russia for many, many centuries before Khrushchev gave it. Basically, they transferred it, and there are still people questioning whether it was even done properly or legally, because Crimea was transferred to Ukrainian administration within the Soviet Union about 100 years ago. So, and there was more like an administrative, like a formal sort of thing. At the time, there was no independent country called Ukraine. It was the Ukrainian SSR, part of the USSR. So
I see.
Crimea had belongs to Russia prior to that. The Black Sea Fleet, that very important strategic Russian fleet, is stationed in Sevastopol in Crimea. And the Russians have made it clear that, you know, they were never going to accept American warships in Sevastopol, in the vicinity of that fleet. And then, you know, Western people can respond by saying that, yeah, but it's not a threat. Russians tell us that they feel threatened, that they feel the national security, the national interests are compromised if NATO is that close to their borders. And there are all the NATO countries on Russia's border. I mean, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia already joined the NATO, but those countries are different because their history is not as intertwined. They're not Slavic people. They're not related to Russians. They kind of, and they're also very, very small countries, tiny populations, large Russian populations, but small populations. And it wasn't as strategically important. Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe. It is incredibly strategically important to Russia. And, you know, I do believe in countries' sovereignty. I'm not saying that Ukraine should never be allowed to be independent, but this question is not really about making Ukraine independent, because the West sending in all those weapons, military aid and monetary aid, what they're doing is they're making Ukraine reliant on them. They're making Ukraine dependent on them.
Almost like a puppet.
History.
Like a puppet.
So, and you know, and I understand that as well, but then it's very disingenuous to frame this conversation in terms of independence, because no one wants Ukraine to be independent. You know, it's not about helping make Ukraine a sovereign country. It's about making Ukraine a slave to the West, so that, you know, they can just dictate what they're going to do. And strategically, there's the strategic importance of Ukraine. It's at a very crucial geographical location. Huge, massive border with Russia, very big population. It would be very beneficial for NATO to have a base in a country like that. But then Russia would feel their security threatened to the core. And there are people, so it's like there are people saying that Putin really considers Ukrainians to be Russians, and that's not really the case. This is like a very, very complicated conversation, but Putin has talked about it a lot. I've been following it for years. You know, he's written essays about it, and he's made it clear. Actually, you can look this up. It's still on the Kremlin website. He wrote an essay about this, like this connection between Ukrainian and Russian history. And he did say that Ukrainians have the right to decide if they want to be independent. He talks about that when you have a nation and then you have a large nation, different spread across vast regions, then different dialects develop, which eventually evolve into different languages. And then the different regions then have different interests. And then a point comes when when a tribe or a region may decide to call itself a new nation. A new nation can then be formed. And he said that that's what happened with Ukrainians, partly due to Polish influence, and this is historically accurate. And he's talking about how he's willing to respect that. What he's not gonna respect at the moment is Ukraine joining NATO, a military alliance set up in opposition to Russia with the sole aim, basically, to go against the Soviet Union.
And I think, you know, NATO. Well, I was just going to say, like, talking about NATO, you know, I think that there's so many people who just, you know, who just know, like you said, the most sort of superficial aspect of international policy and history and all of this. And so what a lot of Americans I know and Europeans think is well, NATO's always good and we're always the good guys and we'd never do anything, we'd never do anything aggressive to Russia, or we would never like go to war with Russia or invade Russia or hurt Russia or anything. We were the good guys, we're the white hats. And that's just not that's just not how history is. And so, yeah, from our perspective, it seems like, oh, it's harmless for us to have more and more influence in this part of the world and encroaching influence on Russia and NATO and all that. But from their perspective and from a historical perspective, where America has and has messed, the West has messed in all kinds of countries, politics and everything, right? That's just not how we are seen, and how the West is seen and how NATO is seen by a lot of people. But we don't understand that over here. So it boils down to this black and white thing. And Tulsi Gabbard, that's one of the things that she's really been raising awareness about, is the significance, how this didn't just start with Putin's invasion, the significance of this encroaching power of NATO and of these moves to try to get Ukraine aligned with NATO and everything, right? So
yeah, and that's why I mentioned those Western politicians too, who've been telling us for decades that the only way we're going to have security in Europe and more broadly in the world is by involving Russia, not by going against Russia. And what that would necessitate is to honor the Russian perspective, to have an ongoing dialogue about these things, because it's one thing that we know. Perhaps we know for sure that NATO is a purely defensive alliance, and they're like, are they crazy? Like, what are they like? Why would they assume that we are trying to attack them? Of course we are not. But then we have to try to understand where they are coming from and respect that is their perspective. It might be completely wrong, but then try to convince them that it's wrong, and these Russian concerns haven't been respected by the West. And that's an issue because Russia it may not be for much longer, but it still is a superpower in the world. It's still a large economy. And it's very irresponsible to not even try to have that sort of dialogue about their concerns.
Right. And I think that things are always more complicated in the world than the easy media narratives. You can even look at the most seemingly black and white, clear-cut things in history, and you can see that there's ways that that's more complicated. For instance, we all agree Hitler was horrible and he did horrible things and, he destroyed Germany and Europe and whatever. But a lot of us know that you look for the roots of Nazism, or how Nazism could take hold, or some of the things that Hitler was irrationally responding to. And what you do see is like the Treaty of Versailles and the way that Germany was put in a really horrible position at the end of World War I that really set them up for then all of that crap that would happen, right?
And it made it easier for them to gain allies like Hungary. It was the same thing. Hungary lost 2/3 of its territory after the Treaty of Versailles, the Trianon.
I did not know that. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, the Treaty of Versailles was not helpful, as it turned out. I'm curious. So, what do you think? So, you said that be more open to Russia's perspective, be open to diplomacy. So, your perspectives, I would think, is not that Ukraine should just give itself up to Russia, or we should say just take Ukraine or whatever, right? Do you have any kind of sense of how something like this could shake out?
Well, I think the peace deal proposed by Elon Musk was a pretty reasonable one, the most reasonable one.
What was that? And what was that?
Well, he basically said that the referenda should be repeated. So there were all these votes that were obviously fake, in these territories Russia occupied. So he called for those elections to be redone under UN supervision or whatever international body both parties accept, so that the people living in those contested regions can have a say where they want to belong. And then the second one was that Crimea, we should just accept that Crimea belongs to Russia because it has always belonged to Russia. It's majority Russian speaking. And it was really just an administrative decision on Khrushchev's part. There's really no reason for Crimea to have ever been transferred to Ukraine. And then also for Ukraine to remain neutral. to not to join NATO and possibly not even join the European Union.
I see.
So
see.
these
Okay.
were, yeah.
Well, I mean, those sound like good recommendations. I know there's a perspective that, has taken hold with a lot of people in the West and a lot of people, who are not educated on this. And I don't pretend to be educated on it either, right? My basic position is just always kind of to distrust media narratives and also not to think that Putin is just flat out insane. But that the narrative among a lot of people over here in the West seems to be that Putin has lost his mind. He's, nearing the end of his life, and he's got some demented, crazed view that he's got to leave his mark before he exits and all of that. And just sort of overlooking, like you said, all of the nuances of the situation and the fact that the clock did not start when Putin invaded, that there's this whole history preceding this. And this is the thing that I feel like Americans especially are generally pretty ignorant about, is the lead up to these things, like it with the Iranian Revolution. I'm not a fan of Iran or anything, right? But I was watching, I'm really fascinated by that period in history, and I've watched a lot of documentaries and read a lot about it. The classic American perception was that that our problems with Iran started with the Iranian Revolution, right? And it was like, why do they hate us? Why are they mad at us? Well, there's like a whole history here of the U.S. The West fomented a coup. There was a democratically elected, or chosen leader in Iran, and the West overthrew that guy and then installed the Shah and was, taking oil out of the country and all that, right? So, but there's this whole history that people don't know.
Yeah.
And so to think about the Russian-Ukrainian conflict also in a similar way, not to say that Putin is great or that the Ukrainians should just lie down and let their country get, taken over or raped or whatever, right? That's not what we're saying, but that there is a whole history here and a lot, and that no side is totally clean in this, and it is very complicated. And Russia, they do have some concerns. They do have some legit concerns, right?
Yes. So Russia should not have invaded Ukraine. Just, I just have to keep reinforcing this. It was a terrible decision, as we're saying now, and they didn't want this. I don't think it was in anyone's interest for the war to be dragging on for that long. It was a massive miscalculation on Russia's part. I guess they just weren't counting on the West, especially America and the European Union, to be giving that much aid. I mean, it's unprecedented. It is just
really
incredible. So the tens of billions now. I mean, I was just watching a speech by Rand Paul, which was 6 months ago, where at that point it was 60 billion. The military aid since 2014 up until that point, what America had already given Ukraine. And the EU is voting newer and newer packages of support worth billions and billions of euros on a monthly basis. And then not to mention the sanctions, which is a whole other conversation, but the sanctions which have just backfired so horribly and driven up energy prices like crazy across Europe, where German pensioners are now being taught to keep warm by putting candles in ceramic bowls and flower pots and not to take that many showers. I mean, that's where we are now. So.
Well, and the interesting thing, you mentioned that about the energy prices, and that just sort of gets simplistically laid down at Putin's feet too. Like, oh, Russia did this, so energy prices, and it's like, well, there are also decisions that we're making, the West is making, and so forth. That are, like you said, that are backfiring or contributing to this as well, perhaps. I see a lot in the media, and again, Western media and everything, but I see a lot in the media about how, Russian opinion, Russians are just disgusted with this war, that Russian men, are fleeing en masse to not be conscripted, that people in Russia are disgusted. They don't feel like they can really express it, but they're disgusted with this and so forth. Do you think that we can trust that depiction of Russian sentiment, or do you think it's a lot more complicated than that?
Well, I have a Russian friend who fled Russia, actually. She's a girl, but she actually has British citizenship, so she decided to leave. And everyone who's been able to, actually, that I know of, has left. Just worried about their own safety, basically, just in case Russia is attacked. You can't rule it out. It's extremely unlikely, but people are not going to take that risk. And I think support in Russia for the war has definitely gone down. it was now, it's still not communicated as a war. I think you still go to prison in Russia if you refer to this as a war. You're supposed to call it a special military operation. There was a narrative from the start. So again, I'm not on Russia's side.
Yeah.
When I criticize the Western media, obviously you have that sort of propaganda on steroids in Russia. It's not a free country. There's no such thing as a free press, obviously.
Right.
And it is a horrible thing for the Russian people as well. I think most of them definitely don't support it now, especially when the news of dead soldiers. I mean, how many tens of thousands of men have died, just Russians, and then Ukrainians as well. I'm not sure.
And there's, yeah, I mean, the war is not, it's not going as well as hoped from Russia's perspective, and they've been taking a lot of casualties, and they're having, again, a lot of issues with like conscription and with even having like proper, staffing and all of that, right, of their military. And so yeah, there's clearly issues with that. But it's interesting how when Russia started losing or seeming to lose or whatever, right? Of course, even with the fog of war, it's kind of hard to tell who's really winning or losing either. Like I showed, for instance, my boyfriend, he was in the military for many years, and he's very skeptical about propaganda during wartime because there's so much misinformation. And so I would show him, like, throughout this conflict, I've been showing him these like heartwarming stories about Ukrainians. Like there was a story that came out, you probably saw this, about how there was an island that the Russians were attacking, and the Ukrainians, some of the Ukrainian soldiers said to the Russians, go fuck yourself. And it was like, this rah moment tonight. So I would show my boyfriend some of these things, like, and this is cool or whatever, and he'd be like, I wouldn't trust that if I were you. There's just all kinds of propaganda coming out. You don't know what's going on there, what's not going on there, whatever. Yeah. And I only say that because I think there was a lot of surprise that Russia, the feeling was like Russia's getting their ass kicked and whatever. Well, if they are getting their ass kicked, we don't know that, but if they are, it has something to do with the fact, like you said, that the West is pumping billions and billions of dollars into Ukraine and backing them up, and weapons and all of that. So like Russia is against basically the entire West on this, which I'm not saying that, oh, poor Russia, they just sort of stumbled into this, but like it is true that Zelensky and Ukraine are, like you said, receiving tons of funding. And we in the United States, in the West, we love to, you can go back to like the Vietnam War or beyond, right? We love to get involved in these conflicts where it seems like we can come in wearing the white hat, or there's a side that's right. And then it always turns out to be more complicated, right? Than just a right or a wrong. So we were going to get into Vietnam because we were going to defeat communism. And oh my God, we got to keep the communists out of Vietnam. So, we misunderstand that there's a civil war going on there, and nobody really cares much about communism. It's just that the Viet Cong, they needed somebody to fund them and help them, and the communists were the only ones who would do it, right? And so it's a really complicated situation. And this reminds me of that in some ways. Yeah.
We do have to give, I do want to give America credit though, because there's been involvement. Like it's not true that like every single involvement since Vietnam has been a disaster, because the Serbian war, for example, America's went in there and helped guarantee the independence of Kosovo. That's an example where it was justified and it has worked out okay.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, actually, because the next thing I was going to say was that we visited Sarajevo probably about it's like 10 years ago now, well after the war and everything, but we visited Sarajevo, and so we drove around, we talked to different people, and I started reading during that period, I started reading some books about the conflict. And one of the things that it got into was the fact that yes, while it seems that the Serbs were the aggressors and whatever, and perhaps were, that actually once again there was a long lead up to this where it seemed like the international community made some missteps that almost seemed to heighten the Serbian feeling that they were sort of like Russia in a kind of an almost difficult position, right? Where like agreements that they had counted on were now being infringed upon or whatever. I'm trying to remember this book that I read. But again, not to say that turns out the Serbians were right or anything, but that even that situation, it seems like, that was precipitated to some degree by some sort of overly optimistic missteps by the international community, who didn't realize that there were a lot of tensions here in a really complicated situation. You start kind of moving stuff around or propping up one side or whatever, things can get out of hand. So I don't know, you probably know a lot more about that conflict than I do, but I just remember when we were there and doing some reading and stuff and finding out that yet again, the lead up to this was a bit more complicated than we were told.
Yeah, I mean, it was just in a few words that there might be some parallels, because the current conflict between Ukraine and Russia, you can think of it as an aftermath of the breakup of the Soviet Union, and how the borders in many cases were drawn in ways that are still contested.
Exactly.
Just like, exactly. you know about the aftermath of the Treaty of Versailles. So Western powers decided to draw the newborn borders in Central Europe without having any knowledge of how ethnicities are distributed, and over a million, like almost 2 million Hungarians ended up outside the borders of the country, for example. Transylvania used to belong to Hungary, and the whole of Slovakia and
where did they end up? So where were they? What country did they end up being drawn into? You said that
Slovakia was a part of the Czechoslovakia up until 91. So there was no such country as Slovakia until 1991, and then Transylvania became a part of Romania. Okay. Transylvania used to be an independent sort of region, I guess, but with the Yugoslav wars, though, so in the sense that we can think of the current conflict as the aftermath of the USSR breaking up. With the Serbian war, it was Yugoslavia breaking up, and Yugoslavia was largely controlled by Serbians, and they didn't want to let Croatians go, basically, and Croatians insisted on becoming an independent country. So in very, very simplified terms, that's why I'm saying that it is kind of similar.
Right. And and I think another thing that we Americans in particular, not so much the West, because it's different in Europe, but we Americans, like we have some regional differences between people, generally speaking, people living in Louisiana versus people living in New York or whatever, but it is not the same as you have all of these countries in Europe. And like you said, it gets so complicated with you can have one country with one ethnic group in another country. And there's just a lot going on. And there's a lot of differences that are really pushed together. And so I think that it's like you said, each region, there's thousands of years of history. We just don't have that much history over here in the US either. I understand the Native Americans were here and all of that, but people know what I'm saying, right? We just don't have that much history. And so you go to Europe and it's you've got thousands of years of history. I remember that my boyfriend, in the Army, when he was stationed in Germany, he said that he would have these talks sometimes with Germans. And this was after 9/11. And they would say things to him like, for you think about ground zero and it's New York City. For us, ground zero is this entire country. World War II, this entire country was destroyed, right? Basically. So you just got all of that complicated history.
And the borders, we can't emphasize the importance of these often flawed borders, and how they're going to be contested for many, many generations to come. And again, all these politicians like Kissinger, for example, when he talks about how we must try to understand Russia's point of view, no one would say that Russia had the right to just ignore those national borders. That's why diplomacy should have been the solution. That's why their perspective should have been taken into account. And that's why we should have been more willing to settle this conflict in diplomatic terms. And the West has repeatedly turned its back on that prospect. And this is what happened. And something that I'm interested in your thoughts on that, because I've been dwelling on it a lot, is whether, in philosophical terms, whether someone who has the power to prevent a tragedy, you're not the one causing the tragedy, but you could take steps to prevent it. Then where does your responsibility lie in that? How are you actually responsible then for that tragedy? Because this is what we're seeing here, basically. The West could have prevented this tragedy. The West didn't cause it, but it had many, many opportunities to prevent it from happening. So is that responsibility then, you know?
I mean, I think there's certainly some responsibility there. And, and I think that, and I think to the extent they caused it, I mean, to the extent that it sounds like you're saying that like the West has abdicated its responsibility to pay attention to some of these nuances, or to be mindful of it, or to be mindful of how NATO expansion would feel to Russia, So, I mean, there's this view, I guess I understand. What I was going to ask you was, what do you say to some people who say that it sounds like you're underestimating Putin, that he has shown himself to be ruthless and power hungry. And isn't it possible that he's at the end of his life and he has calculated correctly that most world leaders and most leaders throughout history have been judged primarily on whether they expanded the borders of their nation or not. And so he's just going to kind of go for broke and fuck it, whoever I have to kill or whatever. I'm going to expand my borders and seal my legacy. So people who would say to you that maybe you're underestimating the fact that maybe this guy is actually worse than you think. What would you say to that?
Well,
or less rational?
Evidence. I mean, show me the evidence. Show me the evidence that Putin was planning on taking the whole of Ukraine. No one has produced any such evidence. You can say that he's not telling the truth. You can say that everything he's been talking about for the last over 10 years and everything he's been writing, it's all been lies. You can say we can't believe him because he's a murderous dictator, and there is truth to that. But then show evidence to the contrary. Show evidence that he went in with the intention of taking the whole country. No one can really back up that claim, because military experts have spoken about how that's just not how you take a country. It wasn't nearly enough military personnel to take the whole of the country. And also, no one would have believed that he would have been able to hold on to it, even if he'd taken it. It's not that clear what the exact intention was. I mean, the Russians would say that they wanted, that this was just a retaliation because they're just going to go to any length necessary to ensure Ukraine remains neutral. That basically a country on their border that they share a history with, that's utterly devastated and destroyed and leveled, is still better than a neighboring country that's a Western ally.
Possible aggressor, the future, all that.
It's terrifying. I mean, it is a terrifying story, but this is kind of the closest I think you can get to the truth. I don't think he wanted to take the whole country, or again, no one has any evidence to show that the Russians were really planning on taking and holding on to the whole of Ukraine.
What do you think about, I mean, I kind of imagine what you feel about it. What are your thoughts on like Zelensky's press tour that he's been engaged in, for months now? He did a Vogue, he and his wife did, the Vogue cover shoot. He's been on, different American programs. He showed up at, I think, our Grammy Awards, and just, doing all kinds of press and stuff. Do you see?
We've got an Oscar. He's also got an Oscar from Sean Penn now. Have you seen that?
Oh, God.
That was very difficult to watch.
Was there like a little ceremony where Sean Penn like bequeathed it?
Well, he's become best friends with Sean Penn somehow. He's just been Sean Penn.
Sean Penn went over there to film a documentary. Sean Penn, I think, is a bit, I hate to say this, but I think he's a bit of a disaster tourist. And so he over. No, I mean, I know he
was filming a documentary at one point. Yeah. And I think he convinced Grammy to have Zelensky speak there, but which is just, again, turning it into a show at the expense of all those lives being destroyed. They're treating it as entertainment, because what is the Grammys about? It is about entertainment. So what is a wartime leader doing there? Because that's what Zelensky is. I mean, he's not primarily an actor anymore. We want to believe that he's a serious leader. What is he doing at an entertainment show? Raising awareness. well, it's all over the news. I mean, how much more awareness do you want to raise? And okay, raise awareness, but there must be other ways to do that rather than within the framework of an entertainment show, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And Sean Penn going over there, what he said, they were just sitting around this table, and Sean Penn handed over the statue, and he was just saying that when you win the war, you can bring it back to Malibu. So
that's hilarious. That can be where Zelensky ends up after all this is over, and he has to, you know, maybe like go into exile or something if things go bad or whatever. He can hang out with Sean Penn in Malibu. No, it's funny you mentioned Sean Penn. This is kind of random, but he went through a divorce recently. He was married to Vincent D'Onofrio's daughter, and he went through a divorce. And when asked about it, Sean Penn said in an interview that something to the effect of young, beautiful, vivacious women don't like it when they marry grumpy older men who have to get wasted by noon every morning to deal with the Trump presidency. He's like, said something like, my wife does it, you know, beautiful young women, vivacious women don't like it when their old craggy husbands have to drink, what did he say, like a half a handle of vodka and take some Ambien and be out by noon every day just to deal with the Trump presidency.
Yeah, they have to do it.
Yeah.
Because they have no choice, yeah. Yeah, but Zelensky really is a fascinating character. I mean, I'm sure there's going to be a film based on his life. There's going to be a Hollywood film. Maybe he can play himself. Although what he's doing right now is the role of his life.
Yeah, I mean,
he had a more minor role in Trump's impeachment, but this is the really big one.
So I read that Zelensky, before this conflict, that Zelensky's approval ratings were in the toilet. Like he had an approval rating of like 17% or something. Have you heard that prior to this conflict? I'd read that somewhere, that he had a really bad, that he had not been doing well, and that it looked like, you know, his days were numbered as leader of Ukraine, and he had his poll ratings were in the toilet. And so one of the things this has done, it's just turned him into a hero.
Well, I think you have to look at poll numbers in Ukraine differently, because no leader is going to have a huge share of support just because the country is so divided, because the proportion of those who want to belong to Russia, want to be closer to Russia, is so huge. They were never going to support him. Although, I mean, he is a native Russian speaker. That's another interesting question about, you know, what makes someone Ukrainian, for example, looking at the history and everything. So Zelensky was born into a Russian Jewish family, basically.
Is he part Jewish? Or is he Jewish?
He is Jewish. It doesn't matter that he's Jewish, but he's
no. I was just going to say, don't tell Kanye West.
Yeah.
No. But what's the point you're trying to make?
He's a Russian Jew, basically. So what he didn't even speak Ukrainian until, I mean, Ukrainian and Russian are very, very similar, but I think he was 10 or 12 when. And people say, I don't speak Russian, but people say still speaks with an accent. Like you can, like, so, you know, we have countries like that in Europe, obviously, where there's more than one official language, and then the leader may come from one or the other side of the country. It's not unheard of. But, you know, and the country itself too, we talked about the history of Ukraine a little bit, but also the relationship with Poland is very interesting, because a huge chunk of the country, of the western part of Ukraine, was actually basically stolen from Poland by the Soviet Union. It became part of the Soviet Union. Eventually, when Ukraine became an independent country, it became part of Ukraine. Same with a large chunk of Hungary. There's like 200,000 Hungarians in Ukraine. Yeah. And by the way, one of the first things Zelensky did after he was elected was make the already existing language laws, made them much stricter, so that it became illegal to speak any other language apart from Ukrainian. Like shopkeepers were required by law to speak Ukrainian unless someone requested otherwise. So this was something that those Hungarians living there complained about, because it just became illegal to even use any other language in schools. You know, and there used to be Hungarian schools and things like that. These laws were directed more against Russians, obviously, but affected all those minorities. And then same with parts of Moldova, So there is a certain irony in it, and Poland is understandably siding with Ukraine because historically they are adversaries with Russia. But what they're doing basically is making sure, so the territory, part of the territory they're defending used to belong to their own country. It was taken by the Soviet Union, by Russians basically, and that's part of the territory they're defending now. So there's all this, like, it's just, there's a lot of weirdness to it.
So complicated. Well, I mean, I think that just shows us, how complicated history is. And then like the longer your history is, the older your history is, and then like the more diversity you have and more people, different cultures packed in. I mean, there's a lot going on there. And again, that's why we can agree that Russia was the aggressor, that they shouldn't have done what they did. It's tragic, et cetera. But also what we're trying to say is that you can't just go by the simple media narratives that we get, because the truth is always a lot more complicated than that. So do you have any thoughts about kind of, I know you can't predict necessarily, but do you have any idea how this ends up? If you just had to guess, like, do you think Putin just going to keep fighting until what? Or do you think there is going to be diplomacy, or you think he's going to set off a tactical nuclear weapon? Or I know he was kind of backing away from that. I know that he gave a speech. Yeah. Putin gave a speech, several days ago or a week ago, affirming that we are not going to use nuclear weapons. But
I don't think they're going to use nuclear weapons. There's really not much benefit from using a tactical nuclear weapon on such a long front line anyway. I mean, what would it achieve? You could kill, I don't know, maybe 10,000 people.
Really demoralizing people, maybe, but
yeah, but
not at the cost of the entire world being really pissed off at you.
Yeah, it's not in his interest. It's not in anyone's interest. I don't think that's going to happen. But I do think the war is going to go on much longer. I don't even think we're halfway through, to be honest. It will probably have quieter parts, and then now the winter is coming. The Russians withdrew from Kherson.
Winter is coming. Oh man, yeah, it's the notorious Russian winters that have frustrated or destroyed many a conqueror, right? So, but the Russian-Ukrainian winters. I was just watching a documentary on Napoleon, and it's like, God, he really fucked up going into Russia. Anyway.
Yeah, they talk a lot about how general winter is usually on Russia's side. Historically, it has been,
even in a conflict because I would think that Ukraine is used to harsh winters too, right? So, but it would be more on Russia's side.
But they're destroying their energy infrastructure, so that's what they've been doing for the last few months.
I see.
And like yesterday, they were attacking Kyiv mostly, but they've attacked. I mean, Zelensky said a few weeks ago that 40% of the country's energy infrastructure has been destroyed. So there's millions of people at any point without water and electricity and heating as well. And the weather is already freezing these days at night. So yeah,
I can't imagine. I can't even handle, I have trouble handling, 30-degree temperatures here in Texas. So I can't imagine. Let's see what I was going to ask. There's something else. So what would we talked about the need for nuance and all of this. So ideally, what do you think the US, like if you were president of the United States or whatever, what do you think our response should be? I'm assuming that you think we should not be basically writing a sort of a blank check to Zelensky or propping him up to this degree. And obviously we should pull back on the NATO stuff. Is that basically your recommendation, and encourage some diplomacy from Ukraine's side?
Well, it's difficult to say because America has benefited from this. I wouldn't go as far to say as they provoked it on purpose to then benefit from it. Like I wouldn't, that's like conspiracy theory territory, but it has turned out beneficial in various ways. Partly
what are some of those ways? What are some of those ways?
Well, one is I've written about this on my Substack. I've been meaning to kind of try and
people should check it out. Yeah, we'll link to it below.
It's eulogyforeurope.substack.com. So one way is that because of the soaring and unpredictable energy prices in Europe, a lot of companies have moved to America, and this has contributed to American GDP. But but then obviously on the longer run, the main American interest is weakening Russia, undeniably, And unfortunately, in the short term, this may seem like a good idea, or in the medium term, but unfortunately, in the very long term, what will end up happening is that Russia is getting pushed closer to China. They're basically pushing Russia into China's arms. And that's another thing that Kissinger was, I think, right about. His basic foreign policy in basic terms was to try to divide the Soviet Union and China as much as possible. He understood, and I think most American politicians during the Cold War understood that it was a very bad idea to push Russia into China's arms, and that's exactly what they're doing now. So, but in the short and medium term, it may seem like a weakened Russia serves America's national interests. If they could really, really weaken Russia's military power, in theory, that would be good for America. But again, in the long run, I think it's going to backfire.
That's interesting. Yeah, the China thing, that was something that I'd already thought about. And I think some people are thankfully bringing up in the media is that, okay, so the more Russia gets pushed, where are they getting pushed? They're going to find an ally, and their big ally, it has been China. So are we looking at just an increasing, ever strengthening alliance between China and Russia, which I think is what you're saying with all of this. This has been really fascinating. And I think people are seeing an entirely different side of you. And I, again, it's always kind of humbling to talk to a European, first of all, about any of this, because you realize, I mean, it's sad to say, even an somewhat educated person like myself, you realize how much you don't know. And I think that's one of the basic things that you learn, that we should all learn in this, and in a lot of situations, is a kind of humility about all that we don't know and all that we don't understand, particularly, over here in America. So when so much of this, what you're talking about, is kind of alien to us, right? But I really appreciate this, everybody. We're going to continue with these types of discussions. Check out our different channels as well. We've got some different channels, and check out Greta Aurora's stuff on Substack. Really fascinating. And the title of your essay was the Eulogy for Europe. Is that right?
Eulogy for Europe is my Substack.
Okay, we'll link to that below. And we'll continue these types of discussions and talk about more stuff as well. Do you have any last thoughts? Anything you wanted to end up with?
Well, I really hope I was able to provide some understandable historical context. And there's just so much
absolutely.
to cover. I hope I hope your takeaway is not that I'm on Russia's side. I'm trying to remain neutral, and the dominant media narrative in the West is that you can't be neutral. If you say you're neutral, that means on Russia's side. I don't believe that. I think it should be possible for countries and for individuals to remain neutral. And also, I just want people to be very wary of any media narrative that frames any sort of conflict in terms of good versus evil. That's sort of black and white thinking. It's never helpful. There's always more to the story. That's what Russian state media is doing. They keep feeding in. They're calling Ukrainians Satanists, and they're saying that the West is serving literally the devil. It's like very, very dark, bleak stuff. But it's not that different to what the West is doing in demonizing Russia. So just those sort of good versus evil narratives, light versus dark,
right?
They're never productive.
Right. And what I try to remember is, even on things where I'm not very well educated, like for instance, this particular situation, knowing what I know about the media from all that bullshit with Amber Heard and Johnny Depp and Marilyn Manson and all of that other Me Too shit that we follow, what I'm constantly, saying to myself in all these situations is, remember, that is the same media that's now telling us how to feel about these other things. And it doesn't mean that everything that they're saying is wrong, or that Russia is right, or anything like that. But it just means that, again, we should be adults about the way we look at things, and not see things in these childlike narratives. All right. Well, thank you so much. And we're going to do this again. And everybody, I hope that you enjoyed this, and we're going to be awaiting our checks from Vladimir any day now. So, all right. Bye, everybody. Bye, Greta.
Thank you. Bye.
That was wonderful. You need to be a history professor or an international policy professor.
Well, was it really? I
that was
don't
great.
know.
I thought it was
don't know.
way more impressive than the stuff we normally talk about.